Another Dead Teenager, a Paul Turner Mystery, Book 3. Author, Mark Richard Zubro. Stonewall Inn Mysteries. Narrator, Eric Aust. Paul dragged himself out of bed at 7 the next morning. In the shower, he let hot water pour onto his tired face for 5 minutes in an attempt to revive himself. Originally, he'd been scheduled to be off today, but with a case such as this, he knew it would be a full day. After he dressed and eased his way downstairs, he peered into Jeff's room and saw his younger son still asleep. He then listened at the door to the basement upstairs. He heard a muffled snort and a mild snore, but no other noise from the boys gathered below. He turned the automatic coffee maker on, poured some tomato juice in a glass, and leaned against the counter. Tired as he was now, he knew it would only get worse if the case wasn't solved in a short time. A normal Saturday would find Paul involved with his sons in household chores, with Brian trying to sleep through them all and Jeff attempting to play computer games instead of working. After the morning squabbles, he'd make the afternoon a time to play with either son, take them somewhere, go to one of their sporting events, or find something they were interested in and do it. Much as work occupied his mind, he still wanted to stop at Mrs. Tolucci's before he left. He had to organize care for Jeff during the day. Brian and his buddies had plans for the morning and afternoon, and Paul wanted the house in some semblance of order when he returned. He enjoyed the vision of the boys downstairs waking up to Mrs. Tolucci in charge. She'd have them scour every inch of house they'd come in contact with. Plus, if he could, he wanted to find out what had been bothering her. The fact that she wouldn't talk about what was wrong only accentuated his worries that it was serious. He hurried next door. He walked into the kitchen, expecting from long familiarity to find Mrs. Tolucci sipping espresso coffee and reading a book at the kitchen table. On a Saturday, she'd have done the dishes and had bread baking in the oven for any weekend feast her family had planned. But this time, Paul found no warm smell of freshness from the oven, and no Mrs. Tolucci at the table. The niece, who met him at the door, said that Mrs. Tolucci was downstairs. Turner found her in the reconverted basement, one of the many projects he'd done for her in return for her watching Jeff and Brian. It had taken him 6 months, but the result was excellent. He had eliminated any dampness and smell, paneled the walls with pine, and installed floor-to-ceiling bookcases to hold Mrs. Tolucci's ever-expanding collection. The shelves overflowed with everything from weighty tomes to the most recent popular fiction. In the center of the room were the only 2 chairs, both black leather with footstools in front of them, a glass-topped table between them, on top of which was a reading lamp, with shaded bulbs reaching to both chairs. Mrs. Tolucci sat in the chair on the left. She wore a faded flower-print house dress and purple slippers. She glanced up at Paul and put her book aside. Paul noted the title, Tolkien's The Lays of Beleriand. He saw tired eyes, listless hands, wisps of white hair not caught and pulled back into Mrs. Tolucci's usually perfectly constructed bun at the back of her head. He seldom noticed her wrinkled face and the flesh drooping on her arms and elbows. Today she looked over 100. Her good morning seemed beyond age and weariness. Paul sat down on the other chair. "What's wrong, Rose?" he asked. She held his gaze with her dark brown eyes. "I have cancer," she said, before he could respond. Some of her old fire and command returned. "I do not want sympathy. I do not want pity. I'm 92 years old. I certainly did not expect to live forever. The hard part is that after telling the family they're going to be over here invading my privacy, slobbering all over, I don't want tears and confessions. I've had a good life, but I'm old. That's what you do when you're old. Die." "Rose?" "And don't you get all slobbery." Paul felt the tears in his eyes. "I'm not going to die today or tomorrow before the doctor could say it. I told her there wasn't much point in painful treatments at my age. The cancer's beyond the point of doing anything about anyway." She ended much more wistfully. "I would prefer, however, not to die in pain." "Rose?" But the doctor didn't know about that, or how long I'd live. The weasel wouldn't give me a straight answer. All she'd say is cancer moves slowly in old people. She snorted. "How lucky for us." "I'll do anything I can to help," Paul said. She smiled her old, lively, affectionate smile. "Thank you. I hadn't wanted to tell you until all the final tests were done. I met with the doctor yesterday. You're the first one I told. She closed her eyes and sighed. At least I beat old Ethel Watson. She lived to be 91. The old witch. Rose was referring to an old rival who had lived a block over for 85 years. Their children had fought when they were little, and Ethel had tried to get one of Rose's daughters sent to an orphanage around 1920. Rose had never forgiven her. She stood up. I've been expecting you. You'll need help with the boys this morning. It's not necessary. I'm not about to physically collapse, she said. I could do today what I did yesterday, and my mind hasn't developed defects overnight. The kid who got murdered. I saw you on one of the 24-hour Chicago news stations. You're on the case, and you've got to go to work. And Brian's got a herd of boys that need ordering. Jeff needs watching. Of course, I'll do it. Paul gave up any attempt at protest. Mrs. Tolucci, sick or well, had an air of command it was useless to attempt to override. That she had gone to the doctor on her own and taken the news without family around was typical of the way she'd lived her life. In the car on his way to work, Paul found himself unable to control his tears. Instead of driving straight to the station, he took Congress Parkway out to Grant Park, parked on Columbus Drive, put a quarter in the meter, and walked to the pedestrian crossing for Lake Shore Drive. He knew he'd be late for meeting Fenwick, but at the moment, he didn't care. He walked slowly along the lake shore. He realized he'd known Rose was old, but understanding she would die because she was old didn't make the reality of her eventual loss easier to accept. It was hard to imagine her not being there. Rose Tolucci was more precious to him than anyone except his sons. Paul's wife, Mary, had died when Jeff was born, in the months before his second son's birth. Paul had come to accept his own being gay. He'd come to love his wife as a friend, and her death had pained him deeply. He sometimes wondered what would have happened had Mary lived and he'd come out to her. Certainly their marriage would have been over. It was one of the great what-ifs of his life. Rose had become a large part of Paul's family. He loved her, fiery spirit and joy in living, her jokes and laughter. She'd had to overcome a tough early life in a dirt-poor hovel in the Taylor Street neighborhood in the early part of the century. He would miss Rose and her fabulous dinners. He loved the late-night snacks she'd throw together and insist he eat after he came home, very late. And she'd put the kids to bed. They'd talk for hours. She had insight and wisdom. He would miss building and fixing things for her. Mrs. Tolucci was one of the few people he would trust implicitly in anything. He would miss that and all the rest. He found himself at the foot of the Adler Planetarium. Already compliments of school buses were disgorging school kids for visits here and at the Field Museum across the street. Even on Saturdays, hordes of kids descended on the place in vast multitudes. The shouting children's voices, punctuated by adult commands, brought him out of his reverie. He turned back toward the car. Rose was still alive, and would make the most of every moment, now and as she had thought her life. When the time came, he'd do everything he could to ease any suffering. As he pulled up to the station, he realized he'd have to tell his own kids about Rose's illness. He closed his eyes and shook his head. Sometimes an enormous day's work ahead wasn't a bad thing. He found Fenwick, the commander, and 6 uniformed cops on the 4th floor, shoving desks aside, dragging cabinets hither and yon, plugging in phone jacks, and toting piles of paper. The 4th floor of the old complex was mostly storage space for musty police department records, which they kept promising would someday be put on computers. They could wait until the turn of oblivion for such a happenstance. Fenwick said, "We've got a task force. The police in Connecticut and Chicago will be cooperating." "And good morning to you," Turner said. "You'll need to start sorting assignments," the commander told them. "Spend some time on that and then begin on the interviews out in the suburbs." "We've got another in the city?" Fenwick asked. "You tell me. You're still in charge? Do it." Turner and Fenwick trooped down to their desks 1 floor below. "We got trouble right here in River City," Fenwick said. "I'm the one who's supposed to quote show tunes," Turner said. "You know you never do. Maybe one of my gay genes is defective. I thought it was the anterior hypothalamus." "You memorize that?" I read all the gay shit in the papers. And I'm eternally grateful and not interested at the moment. This case is going to be a pain in the ass. All calls connected to it are being directed to... I've got somebody screening them already. The wackos have begun to report in. In any high-profile case, the absence of leads was seldom a problem. Every nutcase in the city, from people who spotted UFOs to those who got to the shakes and vapors waiting for the end of the world, would call in with their theories, sightings, facts, wayward thoughts, and tales of aliens. A few you might be able to discard, but almost every one of them had to be followed up. If you didn't, you risked the danger of missing the one call that was actually genuine and could give a real clue or maybe even break a case wide open. We have the people to cover the crazies, Turner asked. Fenwick hunted through a pile of papers on the left side of his desk. For all the follow-ups for all calls from the public, commander gave me a list of 5 people for today. We'll get more tomorrow. He found the list and handed it to Turner. We have to get organized, Turner said. He stood up and reached for the bulletin board on the right side of his desk. He took down the scattered notes and wanted posters and put up Fenwick's list on the now blank 3-by-5-foot cork. In an hour, it was filled with lists of people and their assignments. Cops would return to the scenes of both crimes. Every employee of the parking garage would be questioned. The neighborhood around Lumber Street would be canvassed. The owners of the building would be found and talked to. Somebody would speak again with the kid who found the body. Every playmate and friend of his who might have gone there that day or any other would be questioned. Every employee of any nearby McDonald's would be interrogated in case the robbers in the building had anything to do with where the murder might have been beforehand. All these people would be asked about anything or anyone suspicious that they had seen or noted prior to or on the day of the crime. If the murderer had staked out the killing space, then he or she might have been noticed. Every kid who knew the dead kids at school would have to be talked to. It was a tremendous task, but each interview had to be recorded on paper. Anything promising would be passed to Turner and Fenwick, and even then, they'd have to find time to read over all the unpromising reports. They had to have a handle on every aspect of the case, something a uniformed officer might consider unimportant. Could turn out to be significant, but Turner and Fenwick would probably be the only ones to know that, so they'd read everything that came in. They'd ask the crime lab to return to the abandoned factory at Lumber Street and go through every room on every floor for any more traces of what had happened. It was noon before they left the station. They grabbed a sandwich at Fred's Deli under the Metra train tracks on Harrison Street. They ate in the car as they drove north as they crossed the border into Evanston. Fenwick asked, "What's wrong?" "You haven't said a word since we finished eating. You've been preoccupied all morning." "I thought it was the case, but something's bugging you." Turner told him about Rose Tolucci. Fenwick listened quietly. When Turner finished, he said, "I'm sorry, bud. I know how close you and your kids are to her. If I can help, let me know." "Thanks. You going to tell the kids?" "Yeah, I don't know how. It's going to be tough. She's been the closest thing to a mother they've had." I know. They led a companionable silence born of many years as partners passed between them for the next few miles. Finally, Turner said, "What do we have first?" "List is in the notebook," Fenwick said. Turner dug through the official papers and found the notes written on tiny graph paper. He and Fenwick had gotten into the habit of writing on graph paper and ordering all their notes, not requiring an official form, on the small squares. These often seemed an oasis of orderliness amid the violence and chaos that filled their days. Turner read through the list. "The Kennecott School District people are cooperating in letting us use the high school. That Chief of Police, Rob Start, said they'd been real helpful. Best place for it." Turner nodded in agreement. "They also said they were going to have grief counselors already for any kids who needed it," Fenwick said. "They were well liked and popular?" Turner asked. "That's what somebody said last night. I wish they weren't. It would be great if the first kid or teacher we talked to says he hated both of them and he's the killer." "I'd say you'd been listening to fairy tales, but I barely said a word." "You got the directions someplace?" Turner pulled them out Kennecott High School put all the other schools on the North Shore to shame. New Trier could brag, but Kennecott was the equal of any private high school in the country in facilities, scholarship tests, scores, and alumni are graduates of Ivy League schools and heads of corporations. The campus seemed more like a college's, with wide spaces between buildings, brick walkways among swards of green grass and trees, bountiful with October's harvest of red, gold, orange, and brown. Leaves today, the winds were down, and a hint of summer's warmth had returned to the air. They met the Kennecott Police Department brass in the superintendent's office. Turner thought he'd entered the plush palace of an ancient emperor. Lavish wall hangings, solid teak desk, genuine antique lamps, and knickknacks, including a 19th century Troniseur Lacroix tea caddy. The carpet matched the hues of the autumn afternoon that Turner could see through an enormous picture window. Chief Robsart said, "I've managed to get a huge number of people here. Are coming in for interviews. Everybody wants to help. Lots of people think of the North Shore as clammish or snobbish, but these people knew and liked the Goldsteins and Douglases. Community groups, parents, kids, everybody spread the word. We've had over 300 volunteers for pre-interviews. I'm afraid no one in this crowd is going to have anything bad to say about those boys. I mean, nobody thought negatively about them." "It would be a first," Turner said. "Somebody felt negative enough about them to kill them," Fenwick said. "Well, you're not going to find that among the people we've had in here. I've got the people who knew them best set up to talk to you." "Prior to last night, any problems with the families?" Fenwick asked. "Domestic calls?" "I checked to be certain. None. These are good people." "No way to confirm when they got where they got?" "And if they stayed there?" Fenwick asked. Robsart shrugged. "I have no reason to doubt them." They discussed logistics. The Kennecott cops would continue interrogating people and weed out the ones who knew very little or were just hangers-on. Anyone with something negative to say would be moved up to the top of the list of people for the Chicago cops to talk to. Until somebody with something rotten to say was found, Turner and Fenwick would interview the closest friends and teachers. They asked the Kennecott cops about the presence of sex toys and mentioned the notebook filled with the satanic alphabet. None of them had heard the remotest thing out of the ordinary connected with these two boys. "We can ask around and see if anybody knows anything about that on the force," Robsart said. "They thanked her for checking." "You interviewing the families again?" Robsart asked. "Tentative meet at 6, I think," Fenwick said. "I heard their lawyer's going to be there," Robsart said. Both Chicago cops raised inquisitive eyebrows. "This is the North Shore. They're good people, but they can afford expensive lawyers. Up here, being a cop is too much like being social arbiter most of the time. Real crime." She shook her head. "I don't envy you guys, to be honest. I'm glad it's not me in charge of this one." The first teenagers they talked to burbled with information confirming that both boys had been well-liked and popular. They were kind to other kids in that aristocratic athlete way that long familiar popularity, good looks, natural athletic ability, and experience with girls gave to some boys at an early age. All expressed, as did everyone they questioned that day, astonishment about sexual toys or Satanism. All said they'd never heard either boy discuss or even hint about such things. Jack Goldstein's girlfriend, Sally Baker, came in around 2:30. She wore gray sweatpants and a sweatshirt. As she carried tissues in one hand, her eyes and nose were red. "We'd like you to try and help us find whoever killed Jake and Frank," Turner said. "I don't know if I can help," she said in a wispy voice. She wiped her eyes with a tissue. "I'll do what I can." "When did you meet Jake?" In freshman year, but we didn't start going out until this August. He dated another girl for a couple of years, but she left for college this year, and she dumped him this summer before she left. He felt bad about that. He cried on my shoulder. We've been friends a few years, but I didn't get him on the rebound. Our love was genuine. He was the most attentive guy I ever dated. He brought me only the nicest little memory gifts of our first kiss, first date. Did he ever have any enemies at school? None. Nobody was even jealous. He was always kind to everybody. Any gang activity he might have gotten involved in upset somebody? No, that's impossible. He ever do drugs? Have drugs? No, he was really clean. He was an athlete and took pride in it. Alcohol? No, he was always concerned about driving sober. Fenwick asked, do you know if he always wore his underwear? Yes, as far as I know, he always did. When the cop said quietly, you know, when we make out, I knew. We found several toys in his room, Fenwick said. He listed them. She gaped at him. He ever showed them to you? I've never... Jake! I don't believe it. He wasn't that kind of guy. They let the ensuing silence build for half a minute. Then Turner asked, anything unusual about him at all? He was just an all-around good guy. They let her go a few minutes later. I'm gonna get real tired of this real quick, Fenwick said. Saints don't get murdered. Douglas's girlfriend told about going with him for 2 years. Claimed never to have fought with him. She knew nothing about a possible interest in Satanism. Bob Elliott was a teacher who had known both boys since freshman year. I taught them English freshman year, and they came out for the school play last year. I drove them home once after play practice when Frank had forgotten to tell his parents they needed a ride. And the two of them get along. I never heard of any fights between them. They'd laugh and make jokes in an easy way. Frank could tease a little too much at times, but Jake was always a good sport about it. If not an actual antidote to Frank's strange sense of humor. No fights ever? Fenwick asked. No, great kids. The kind you'd like to have for friends when they're adults. Jake and Frank's best friend on the team was Bob Talbot. They talked to him about 4 o'clock. He was the size of a defensive lineman on a pro football team. He kept wiping tears on the sleeve of his letterman's jacket. They were both cool, Bob said. Best friends a guy could want. We hung around together a lot. Any enemies? Nobody. Even on the team, they were the leaders. Everybody looked up to them, whether we won or lost. They led the line for congratulating the other players. How about Jake breaking up with his former girlfriend? Carolyn? She was nice enough, but she was on her way to college. Guess she didn't want some high school guy dangling around her neck. He was a man. He was real broken up. One night after a few beers, he cried for hours. He drank often. Hey, it was no big deal. Most of the guys have a beer or two at a party. Nobody got uptight about it. Any problems with gangs, drugs? He turned somebody in? Nah. Most real athletes don't have time for that drug stuff. Neither of those guys would touch anything illegal. They asked about sex toys and Satanism. Talbot simply looked confused. They never talked about that kind of stuff. Guys brag about sex, but nobody talks about intimate stuff like that. That religion stuff doesn't sound like Frank. Anything you can tell us about either one, anything at all? That seemed odd in the past few weeks, no matter how unimportant you think it is? The boy scratched his burr-cut head and finally said, Frank and Jake were the 2 straightest arrows ever. I'll miss them. And he began to bawl. At 5, they talked to the coach of the football team. He continued the litany of sainthood that everyone else had repeated. Kept the grades up. No problem in class. No problem on the field. At 6, Turner and Fenwick looked through the files the school district kept on the boys. Each folder bulged with registration forms, standardized test scores, medical reports, IQ scores, and notes from teachers. They were both B students with IQs in the lower 120s. The cops found nothing but glowing praise about the 2 boys' characters. Immediately after finishing with that paperwork, they met with the cops who had been conducting the other interviews. Half an hour later, Fenwick said, they were saints. Everybody nodded heads. Fenwick exhaled a gargantuan sigh. Get the paperwork to us as soon as you can." He and Turner left to talk to the families. In the car, Fenwick said, "I'm depressed." "We get everybody's movements for Thursday night?" Fenwick pointed to a box in the back seat. "Somebody handed that to me as we left." A Kennecomet cop had asked each interviewee about their whereabouts on Thursday night. They tried to make it a routine and simple thing so that no one would take umbrage. The teenagers had been generally cooperative, a few of the adults hostile, but all had complied. Turner reached back and picked up the box. Each piece of paper had a person's name, address, and probable whereabouts for that night. Turner rifled through them. "We've probably got a couple hundred here." "I dare you to rip them into 1,000 pieces and throw them out the window." Turner tossed them into the back seat. "Later, we should interview that former girlfriend of Goldstein's." "Yeah. I wonder if the Douglas kid still had his underwear on." "The killer says, excuse me, would you take off your pants? Give me your underwear. Put your pants back on, and by the way, pow, you're dead." "I'm not in the mood for Kiki on this." "I'll let the killer know." Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold: to offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides, and in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.